Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. Today, we're joined by State Archivist Tom Ruller, Senior Historian at the New Netherland Institute, Dennis J. Maika, Director of the New Netherland Research Center, Charles Gehring, and former Associate Director of the New Netherland Research Center, Janny Venema, as they discuss insights from the forthcoming volume of translations of Dutch colonial documents, now available on the State Archives digital collections. Dennis J. Maika is a senior historian at the New Netherland Institute, a historian of colonial New York with a PhD in history from New York University. He's written numerous articles and papers and served as a consultant for a variety of local history and education projects. He's currently working on a book about Manhattan merchants and their city government in the Dutch and English periods of 17th century New York. Janny Venema is the former Associate Director of the New Netherland Research Center at the New York State Library and Project Associate at the New Netherland Project, which is responsible for translating the official records of the Dutch colony and promoting awareness of the Dutch role in American history. She's the author of a number of books on New Netherland history. Dr. Charles Gehring is the director of the New Netherland Research Center, leading the New Netherland Project. The project is responsible for translating the records of the colony, the Dutch colony, and he's been a fellow of the Holland Society of New York since 1979. Tom Ruller has been New York State Archivist since 2015. Tom has been an active professional and is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. He's been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. So I am pleased to introduce Dennis, Charlie, Janny, and Tom.
Thank you very much, Josie, and welcome to everyone. We're really excited about the opportunity to talk with all of you and share the incredible amount of knowledge that's sitting in front of us. These three individuals know more about the New Netherland experience than probably a lot of New Netherlanders if we were able to talk to them. But I'm not going to talk too much. But what I want to do for many of the folks who might be on this in this program who don't understand the fuller context of these documents that have been translated and published, I thought it'd be helpful just to sort of set the stage. The recently translated and published Volume 8 and the recently translated and soon to be published Volume 13 are the records from the New Netherland colony, the West India Company's administration of the colony. Volume 8 was the minutes of the New Netherland Council. Can you tell us a little bit about what this council was? How did it function? What did it do? Charlie, you probably have talked about the council many times. Maybe you can help us.
Yes, more than I care to remember. The Central Council was in the fort, met in the fort. It was the council for the entire expanse of New Netherland from the Connecticut River to Delaware Bay. And this was in the charge of Petrus Stuyvesant for most of the documents that we have. He met every Tuesday. This was something very important for the Dutch. The Dutch met every Tuesday, not once a year or twice a year as the New Englanders sometimes did, but every Tuesday. People were able to bring in petitions, make complaints, have their problems addressed. It was a very important function of the central government. The central administration, which the council was, had the powers executive, legislative, and judicial. All three of these major powers were under their control. Stuyvesant had a double vote, which gave him an edge on various things. But they considered cases such as somebody shooting the neighbor's pig or dog, slander suits, right up to deserters who were brought back and are about to be punished, and very important cases like Cornelis van Tienhoven, who was accused of theft and precipitating actually the Peach War. His absconding was actually adjudicated in the council. They did find his hat and cane floating in the East River, but he was never seen again. But that's basically the council. They're involved in all of the colony's activities.
But it's a relatively small number, right, Charlie? I mean, the number fluctuated, but was generally about 3 or 4.
Right. Yeah, it's usually Stuyvesant, the scout or scout fiscal, and the secretary, but sometimes there were 4, but usually 3 people. Yeah. So in various cases, it could be a vote of 2 to 2 on deciding a matter, and they would have to sort of argue it out. But in most cases, it was 3 people on the council.
Great. Well, in Volume 8 is the minutes of that council, at least for a particular time period. Well, Volume 13, which is about to be published, Janny, you were the one that translated Volume 13. That's a volume of correspondence. And how does that differ from the minutes? And what does this correspondence cover, at least in Volume 13?
Yeah, the correspondence is like a whole different group of documents, and it is the correspondence between the Director General and the Council of New Netherland. So the council what Charlie just was talking about, and there are all kinds of letters. And what is interesting with this one, at least it's fun, I think, in volume 11 and 12, those are also volumes of correspondence. They are just incoming letters. But here, there's like a whole bunch of outgoing letters, which is nice. I mean, it's difficult too, because there is some tough handwritings with it, but it's really nice. Like it's correspondence between the Director General and the councillors, between, for example, with the directors in Amsterdam. And then if you see, I wrote it down, there were like 15 letters that they wrote to the directors. So that's nice. And they got 12 in from the directors. So, and then I calculated a little bit, like on average, there was about 4 to 5 months between a letter and a response to that. And then sometimes it was a little faster. It could also have been 2.5 to 3 months, but in general, that, you know, it was like 4 to 5 months. So in those letters, they are told what to do by the directors of the West India Company. So they have to report all this stuff from New Netherland, what is happening. So they are talking about the recurring problems with Zeeland or wampum, if you know, and because that as a currency had a lot of problems as a result of the declining fur trade. Then you also see some stuff about developing a trade with the Caribbean, and they have to talk with the directors about that, of course. And but there are also letters, and I jump ahead a little bit. There were like 4 letters that were written to Matthias Beck, who was the director at Curacao. And it handles a lot about the trade in horses and salt, and they would send timber and about slaves. So you see, like the development, they want to develop a trading relationship with the Caribbean islands there. Then they write about the what you call it, the relations with the Indians, which in volume 13 is an important point because they got a lot of trouble at the area where Kingston is, where the Esopus. They talk about the discovery of copper and minerals. They talk about agriculture, the relations with New England, and the situation at the South River, the Delaware. You see, like, list of soldiers and of passengers, invoices of stuff is in it, you name it. Proposals for the peace at the Esopus. Let's see, there is also a commission for Lord Baltimore to demand the surrender of New Netherland. So there's a whole lot of interesting stuff in that correspondence.
That's a
Wonderful.
good, Tom, it's a good point that Janny brought up. 12 and 13 or 11 and 12 are correspondence that I translated years ago, but it's a one-way correspondence.
Yeah.
I only knew how they were responding to Stuyvesant. It was always a problem trying to figure out what the questions were or what the answers might be. But volume 13 is unusual because of that, because you have much more, and 14 as well.
14 and 15, it's also incoming. So it changes after 12.
Right.
So
Yeah.
13 finally gives us a window into what Stuyvesant was thinking and what he was communicating to the people who were in charge of him.
Right. You don't have to guess anymore. You don't have to assume that this is what the question was. You have it there in black and white.
Yep.
And it's really nice with this correspondence because you see how they react too. It's like in the margin of the letters that are coming in, there's all the time little notes in the margins. It's like a little, what you call it, a samenvatting. And it mentions what that paragraph is all about. And so you can see how they read through the letter and then name the different topics. So, you know, they make the marginal notes in New Netherland when they get a letter from the directors. And that's kind of fun too.
It's like a catchphrase they'll put in the margin. And if you look at a Dutch document, the margin on the left side is about 1.5 inches. And that's the purpose, is to write, make notations for future reference. And then they would write right to the end, or right to the edge of the right side, so no one could add anything. And if it wasn't possible with the word to put a word in, they would draw a line to indicate that this was go to the next line. But they were very fussy about making sure nobody added.
And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, if you want to see these documents and see the digital images of them, here at the State Archives, we've digitized all of them, and they're all available through our website under the research topic section of the State Archives website. So you can see these lines and the marginalia and the other notes that are there for yourselves. You may not be able to read them, but you'll at least be able to sort of get a sense of what Charlie and Janny are talking about. Yeah. Dennis, Janny mentioned the slave trade and that relationship with Curacao, and really the issue of enslavement and the slave trade comes up frequently in discussions about New Netherland and the Dutch economy in the 17th century. Can you talk a little bit about the light that these records shed on the slavery trade?
Oh, sure, I'd be happy to. This was incredibly eye-opening. These particular records, I think, well, certainly changed my perception of what the slave trade was like. And I'm hoping that, you know, in the article that I put out, that it would convince other people to do that. I was doing a lot of research and writing about New Netherland, New Amsterdam trade in the 1650s and 1660s, and I'm looking at information about the fur trade and how it may or may not have been declining by the late 1650s, and then the developing trade with Curacao and the provisioning trade and the growth of towns in Western Long Island and Harlem. And I wasn't finding, and especially the Chesapeake trade too. And I wasn't finding as much about the slave trade as I would have expected, because according to the old standard interpretations, New Amsterdam and New Netherland had always been involved in the slave trade. And these new documents basically show that that was not the case, that the slave trade was actually incidental for most of the New Netherland period up until about 1660. That essentially slaves arrived, enslaved Africans arrived in New Amsterdam as a result of privateers. There was only one major voyage of a large slaver that arrived in New Amsterdam in 1655. That was the Wittepart. And that was an anomaly. There was no other large voyages of enslaved Africans directly from Africa until the Gideon in 1660. So what these letters actually showed me, the first few letters, as I started to look at it, luckily I was working with Charlie and Janny, and I got to see this all before it's been published. I got to look at the transcriptions, and I had both of them help me with what I was looking at. And I found that in one of these particular letters in March of 1660, I'm looking to find the date, the Dutch West India Company informed Stuyvesant that they want him to be involved in a small experiment with a little parcel of Negroes, a little sample of Negroes. They want to experiment with bringing in enslaved Africans from Curacao, which was being transformed into a slave entrepot and into Spanish America. This all happened with the fall of Dutch Brazil, and the company was shifting its interest, and it began to include New Netherland more directly in how it was envisioning the transformation of Curacao. And so those particular letters showed me that the company was experimenting with this idea. They wanted to involve private merchants. They wanted to collaborate with private merchants. They wanted to incentivize the private merchants so that they can be involved in the slave trade, because they had done this elsewhere in the Dutch Atlantic, and they wanted to experiment with that as well in New Netherland. And these letters, and ones that continue after that in correspondence 14 and correspondence 15 that I was able to look at for this article, it shows you that they're moving back and forth. They have an idea about what they want to do with this experiment, then they change their minds, then they change their minds back again. Then local conditions change. It's not just incompetence by the Dutch West India Company, it's trying to shift to changing conditions and new circumstances. And they're always looking for a way to make profit, but it's a relatively late innovation, if you can call it that. It's definitely based on the commodification of individuals, which was standard in the Dutch Atlantic. That was sadly, always the case, but it's a relatively new innovation to try to bring a regularized slave trade into New Amsterdam. And that's what these documents prove, I think.
Yeah, and Dennis, they also, what makes me think now when I hear you, the directors were also not in a hurry to send another ship over. Like the two ships that they would use, or they both were lost in the ocean. So they never would send over a ship. Was that also for the slave trade? So they couldn't really trade with Curacao.
No, they were mostly, what I found is that they were interested in developing Curacao, and that any slave trade that would happen in New Netherland was going to be related to Curacao. That the Curacao was going to be the transformation in the Dutch slave trade after the fall of Dutch Brazil. That they were going, and especially in the early 1660s, when the Dutch get the asiento de negro, the right of the Spanish government to trade in slaves, and they were going to move them into the Spanish colonies. They also saw this as a golden opportunity to improve agriculture in New Netherland by bringing in more laborers. But the point was that in the 1650s, there was already a population boom. There was no need for slave laborers, but the merchants that I look at are interested in selling them to Virginia. And that becomes the connection that they begin to try to explore. But it never gets off the ground, because once the Gideon arrives, the English arrive 2 weeks later and the experiment is over.
And the thing you have to remember is there was no labor-intensive activity in New Netherland. There was no tobacco, there was no sugar. You didn't require a large enslaved population as you did in Maryland and Virginia. So these incidental captures or movements of slaves through New Netherland, they eventually went south. They went to Maryland and Virginia because of the tobacco trade.
And that was only in the 1650s, when Maryland and Virginia were beginning to transform into a more slave-based economy. We tend to think that, I'm just listening to someone talk about the 1619 project, and the first enslaved Africans arrive in Jamestown, Virginia, as if that's the beginning of slavery in America. And I guess technically it is, but the institution evolves over time, and it doesn't really take off in Virginia and Maryland until the 1650s and 1660s. And New Netherland is right there, looking to supply them with enslaved Africans.
Go ahead, Janny.
No, I'm good. No, I just cleared my throat.
So these two volumes, volume 8 and volume 13, cover this period 1656 to 1660. which is sounds like it's a very important period in the history and the development of the New Netherland colony, particularly within the broader context of the Atlantic and the relationship with Spain and the development of other colonies. Can you talk a little bit about what was going on in general in the New Netherland colony at that period, only 4 years before the English takeover? What was it like here?
Yeah, I did the first half of 8, so I should start, and I'll pass it on to Janny halfway through.
No, you do.
Right. The New Netherland was in 1656 was just recovering from the Peach War. The Peach War was a disaster for New Netherland. The Indians left Staten Island, Pavonia, which was basically Bergen County, New Jersey, and other places in flames, and destroyed crops, killed livestock, took prisoners. So there was a good deal of activity involved in clearing up what had happened in 1655, trying to get captives back from the Indians, and also recovering land that had been out of cultivation for over a year. And there's a lot in those early pages of Volume 8 concerning these activities. The other thing has to do with the Swedes. The Swedes have been the Swedish colony, which was formed by Peter Minuit, actually, in 1638, was taken by Stuyvesant in 1655. In fact, he was down on the South River, down in Wilmington, Delaware, where Wilmington is now, when the Indians attacked Manhattan. And they had to rush back because when they received news that the center of the colony, New Amsterdam, was in danger. And the Swedes were actually under suspicion that they had something to do with the Indian attack. It's never been proven. There's no smoking gun, but the Dutch at the time, the Dutch soldiers did respond to that suspicion, and they ran amok in the Delaware Valley and destroyed a lot of the Swedish farms and caused havoc. Now, what is interesting, in 56, what do you do with the Swedes? What do you do with the Swedes who are there? There's probably 400 to 500 at this time, Swedes and Finns, by the way. There were a lot of Finns. And the company directors wanted them to be taken out of the area. They suggested first that they be taken to the Esopus to help with the problems with the Indians in the Kingston Esopus area. There was also talk about packing them all up and moving them to an island in the Caribbean, but getting rid of them. Stuyvesant objected to this strenuously. He said, "How would you like to be moved out of your home? I'm going to try to win their hearts and minds." It's something you don't associate with Stuyvesant. This this understanding of what it must have been like to be taken over by another country, and they are left in place. They're called the Swedish nation, and he allows them to more or less govern themselves. And this is a very positive aspect of Stuyvesant's character, I think.
The other thing that's happening in New Netherland overall, in addition to what Charlie described in the South River, is that it's a period of incredible growth from 1657 until 1664. I think I think Oliver Rink described that there were some 35 different voyages that arrived in that short time period. The population almost triples in New Netherlands, certainly in New Amsterdam. It's a period of commercial growth. It's a period where the colony is beginning to thrive. It's after the first Anglo-Dutch War. It's after the Peach War, as Charlie said. It's after the War of Dutch independence from Spain in 1648. It's in that period where there is relative peace throughout the world, where the Dutch are adjusting to the fall of Brazil, as I mentioned before. And the people in New Amsterdam and New Netherland are taking advantage of that. You know, there's really tremendous growth. So the colony, by the time of 1664, is actually prospering, contrary to, you know, the popular myth that the colony was in decline and they couldn't wait for the English to arrive to take it over. So I think that's, you know, coinciding with what Charlie described, that the Swedish colony becomes New Amstel. It's
don't
actually,
forget,
go ahead, Janny, sorry.
No, I interrupted you, sorry. You
No,
should finish.
the most important thing is the fall of Brazil.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Brazil was absorbing, I would say, 90% of the capital and the manpower over about 30 years, or 15 years, I think it was actually. And once Brazil was lost in January of 1654, the focus turns to the Caribbean islands and to the north. That moved things our way to New Netherland, and it's a very important fact to keep in mind. I'm sorry, Janny, I cut
No,
it off.
that's all right. I was going to say similar, Brazil too.
So that, again, there was a large Dutch colony in Brazil that was taken over by the Portuguese.
Right.
Correct?
Well,
it was the primary focus of the Dutch West India Company.
Right. They had taken it from the Portuguese because of the sugar. Right. And sugar was king at that time. And they then lost it to the Portuguese.
Got it.
And it was a shot heard round the world. I forget who said this, but they thought that Recife, the center of the Dutch colony, could never be taken. It was such a stronghold, and when it fell to the Portuguese, it was quite a shock in Europe.
So back here in New York, as Dennis describes it, the colony, New Netherland, which is much more than New York, I know that, but here in New York, up and down the Hudson Valley, the colony was thriving. You've got the large settlement in New Amsterdam, right. Manhattan. You've got the large, or maybe not so large, but the settlement here, Beverwijk in Albany. And then there's the settlement at the Esopus in Kingston. But there was, and I think everyone has talked a little bit about the challenges that were being faced by the settlers at Esopus. Now, Janny, in volume 13, there's quite a bit of correspondence about what's going on, particularly the threats to that little settlement in Kingston. Can you talk a little bit about how they were handling and what was going on at the Esopus?
Yeah. And it's actually so detailed in that in volume 13. You get these letters that cries for help, literally almost. And so when Charlie was telling already about what happened in 1655 and so forth, then a lot of people fled to Manhattan, and people from Esopus, they fled too. And then towards 1658 or so, they kind of came back to the Esopus, and they wanted to continue their settlement there. And it kind of was like a normal situation for a while. But then in May 1658, there was a drunk Indian who killed a colonist. And he also put a house of somebody else on fire. Stuyvesant went there with 50 soldiers, but he said, no, we won't have a war. So he commanded the people to start living in close together. And the cause of this whole thing, the Indians said, was that the Dutch would sell alcohol to them. And by having the younger Indians drink alcohol, the older Indians were not able to control them anymore. So that was the cause of all the trouble. And then in September, so they didn't break out a war at that time, but Stuyvesant got a little bit more demanding, I guess. He wanted them to sell more land to them for this new settlement. And in exchange for all the damages that were done in 55. And then in September 1658, a colonist shot at a bunch of drunken Indians. He killed one, he took one prisoner, and then some 500 Indians, they besieged the new settlement. And this is where all those cries for help begin. There is one person, Andries Laurence, who I think he had some German influence anyway. His letters kind of show that. And he sends a little note, which is, I think, my favorite document of the entire volume. It's a tiny little letter, and oh boy, I wish I had looked that up before. But it's basically asking Stuyvesant for help, and that he is taken prisoner because they had taken a whole group of 13 people prisoner. The Indians had taken them prisoner, and then Andries Laurence was still able to write this little note, and I just kind of try to imagine how that went. He must have had ink and paper with him while he was imprisoned, and or captivated when he was a captive, and that note was brought by an Indian to Manhattan, and you see 3 different handwritings on it. It's the handwriting of Andries Laurence, who is asking for help and saying that he is taken prisoner. Then there is the handwriting that this letter came in then, and then at the bottom it said the Indian took 9 days to get here, to bring this note. So you kind of imagine, and this letter was folded into tiny parts, three times double or so. And you think, like, my goodness, this must have the sweat of a person still in the paper almost. Well, the paper, the documents were how do you call that? They were treated, and so I'm sure there is no sweat in it anymore. But it's just so amazing. And then there were all these little letters, and they were by Andries Laurence, quite a few, but also by what's his name? Not Andries, Smith, Dirk Smith, who was the sergeant. And he wrote many letters too. So you see many letters from the Director General and Council going back to the Aesopus as well. So that is what is, and then eventually Stuyvesant tries to get help, of course, for the to relieve the people at the Aesopus, but he had just sent a whole bunch of soldiers elsewhere. So what he was trying to do was get them from the Burger Guard. And that was not a great success because people felt like, well, we don't really want to go there. Eventually, he had a way to get a whole bunch of people over. He sailed with like some 150 people to the Aesopus, but it took like a long time to get them together. So those Indians had besieged the village for like 23 days. And then the day before Stuyvesant came with all those people, they just had left. So he came basically for nothing, and he declared war in March of 1658, 9 then. And well, you see then how how the soldiers go after the Indians and so forth. And then in July, it ends up with a peace treaty, thanks to the help of the Mohawks, basically, who negotiate with the Aesopus Indians. At the peace treaty, then it's decided that, or negotiated that the Aesopus Indians will permanently move to another location. So that's basically what is described in 13 in pretty great detail. fascinating to read. The handwritings are very hard, but fortunately you can read it in a printed translation.
Janny, can I ask a quick question? Tom, did you come across, I know Stuyvesant sent several Indians from that war. He enslaved several Indians and sent them to Curacao. Did you come across any more information about that as you were doing that translation?
Ooh, boy.
Because there was a ship that was involved in that slave trade I described called the New Netherland Indian.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
show
there were
up in the
25 Indians
South
from
papers. Yeah.
Oh. There were 25 Indians from Long Island, I think, and 25 English people too from Long Island.
But I thought they were from Esopus, no? From the
No,
Esopus War?
Yeah, they went to the Esopus.
Okay.
Maybe I misunderstood something.
No, I'm just wondering if I thought that there were some slaves, some Indians that were taken captive and enslaved.
Oh,
and
yes.
sent-
Yes, Stuyvesant, he sent some Indians to Curacao to
Right.
have them work as slaves out there. Yes.
But that didn't work out and they were sent back. Did you come across anything?
3 or 4. They show up in the Curacao papers.
Yeah,
And they're there, they're not even there a year, I think, and they're
Yeah.
sent back.
right. But that was another interesting highlight of some of the things that were contained in there. Yeah.
But it was the cause because they had a peace in 1660 with the Esopus Indians, but a lot of the people did not agree with that among the Indians, especially the younger Indians not, and they wanted also revenge for the fact that Stuyvesant had sent those people to Curacao.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Another story, another hidden story there.
Oh, there is. 14 is interesting too. Uh-oh.
I just put up the document that Janny was just describing.
Oh, look at that.
So again, so for those of you at home, you can go in and take a look at this document, zoom in and take a look at it, and soon in a year or so we'll be able to put the actual translation up. But it just, again, it's a great example of the hard work that you all have to do as translators to decipher these materials, but also the rich context and the great resource that these documents provide.
Yeah.
I'll stop the share and come back to where we were.
Cool. Very cool.
All of you have mentioned, Peter Stuyvesant's name comes up over and over and over again. He wasn't the only person in New Netherland. And these documents contain information on others. Andres Laurence is a good example, but so many others. Are there lots of other names and identifications of individuals who were in the New Netherland colony within these documents?
Yeah, the one that comes to mind immediately, to me at least, is Augustine Hermans. Hermans is a Bohemian. He's from Prague, Bohemia at that time, and he ends up in the Netherlands. He speaks German, Dutch, English, and probably Czech, I would imagine. But he's a very talented person. He becomes a merchant. He becomes a mainstay of Stuyvesant for important missions. In 1659, there's a problem at the South River where tobacco farmers come in, about 6 on horseback, ride into the colony and start threatening the people, saying that this didn't belong to them. It belonged to Lord Baltimore, and that they should prepare to move or suffer the consequences. As a result of this, Stuyvesant first, when he hears the news, he said, you should have locked them up. You should have put them in chains and brought them to Manhattan, as if they were capable of doing that at that time. But he enlists Hermans to go to St. Mary's City, which was the capital of Baltimore's colony at that time, to negotiate with the English, and he was able to calm things down so that they had some time to breathe on the South River. there are other consequences involved, which I won't get into. If we need time, or if we have a little bit of time at the end, I'm prepared to talk about why the state of Delaware exists.
One of the other things that Hermans was involved with was the tobacco trade, and also the connection between the eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia and connecting that into the South River. And he actually proposed a trade route going up the I guess the Elk River, which is at the tip of I guess Chesapeake Bay, and there was a creek that he was going to connect it to. It was called the Appaquinimec Creek.
Yeah, that's right.
Appaquinimec Creek, and then you portage for about a mile, and then you connect directly to the South River, and that was going to be the new route for a commercial route for tobacco, connecting it to New Netherland. And Hermans became so enamored of that he set up his own plantation there. He was given a huge land grant, I think in 1662, by the governor of Maryland. He set up his own position there. You can still go there to that part of Maryland today. You can travel along Augustine Herman Highway. You can go to near New Bohemia High School. And there's a winery there that's set up at his old estate, and you can get Augustine Herman Rosé while you're there.
Right.
So
if you Herman's
not very good. No, I'm sorry. I don't know.
He suggested this canal to get from the Delaware River over to Chesapeake Bay, and a canal was finally completed in 1846, 100 and some years after Herman suggested.
Yeah, about 2 miles north of where he had in mind.
Right. And the reason I brought Herman's up is because he eventually draws the first map of Chesapeake Bay, and it's incredibly accurate. The King of England at the time was so inspired by this map and by Herman's talent that he gave him that chunk of land in Cecil County, Maryland, which is called Bohemia Manor, by the way.
Right.
And Herman himself is buried there in an above the ground tomb.
Christian Coate has a book on that, Koot, about the map and Augustine Hermans. Anyway,
if you go on the canal and you reach Chesapeake Bay, there's a canal house. Go in the canal house and look up as you go through the door. Look back and up over the door jamb, and there's a picture of Augustine Hermans. At that
winery, there's a map. There's a copy of the map too.
Yeah, which he drew himself. Right.
Wow. Okay, so that's that's the next biography that someone's going to write.
Christian already did.
Okay, good. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to try to save a little bit of time to learn a little bit more about the founding of Delaware. But I want to just ask you a general question just about these documents. We keep throwing out volume 8, volume 13, volume 6, volume 2. Would these volumes make any sense to the people of New Netherland, the people that were running the council? And is that how they organized their documents?
No. They were. Do you want to talk about that, Janny, or do you want me to?
You can do it. That's fine.
It's the original documents were survived in 48 books, 200 and some pages a book, and they are marked A through Z, and then AA through ZZ, and they contain various things that are going on at a particular time, correspondence, council minutes, but not necessarily in chronological order. And apparently this disturbed E.B. O'Callaghan, who was the archivist at that time. And he decided to tear them all apart and rearrange them according to genre, so that the first 3 volumes become basically notarial records, or records of the provincial secretary. Then you get a series of council minutes from 4 to 10 through 10. Then you get correspondence. Then you get sort of miscellaneous documents after that, land records and so forth. But in the process, O'Callaghan managed to destroy the archival integrity of the original documents, which were all intact in 1821 when the Secretary of State of New York made an inventory of these records. And you can see how they were. I have 2 rows of a document I put together, 2 rows of documents showing which documents went where. I forget what's in 13, what the book numbers are, but they run from, it could be a book A, book P, O. He maintained this idea strictly that they should be of a certain type and put in chronological order.
So the volumes that we use today are the creation of E.B. O'Callaghan, who was
right,
an
and he
archivist
did a calendar
and violated a fundamental principle of archives, which is to maintain original order.
Right.
So for all the archivists listening today, don't be like O'Callaghan. Don't let this happen to you.
Right.
But while we're talking about volumes, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Delaware. The work that you've been doing since the 1974 has produced a huge treasure trove of these published volumes of translations. And there is a correspondence between O'Callaghan's volume number and the books that you've published. Volume 8 is now available. People can buy it, and they can find it. It was published by Syracuse University Press, correct?
Right.
And I think the easiest way to find it is going on Amazon. I think that's where probably the primary outlet for this great published work. And that's where volume 13 will also be available. Yes?
Exactly.
Great. And for those of us who like to have a physical volume in our hand, there's nothing like having the words of Janny and Charlie, or them channeling Stuyvesant and the other folks from New Netherlands in your hands. So I encourage
There you go. Yeah.
Eventually, you can actually see the original documents, as Tom brought up during the session, in the archives website. You will be able to take any given document, see the original, look at a transcription, and then a translation. And in this way, there are various levels of understanding. You can either try to comprehend the original or try to decipher the handwriting, or simply look at the information in the translation. But it's going to be a great way for people to learn how to read 17th century Dutch, because not only will you have the original, you'll have the transcription there handy.
Yes. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left before we can turn it over to get some questions from the folks that have been participating today. You've given us the teaser, Charlie. Tell us about how the state of Delaware traces its roots to the colony of New Netherland.
Right. Of all things, Delaware has the Dutch to thank for their existence. I've told this to people down there, and they're vaguely aware of it, but they get the facts confused and they're not quite sure what happened, and they go on to other things usually. But in 1631, there was a patroon ship settled at Delaware Bay, where Lewis, Delaware is now, called Svanendal. And it was the major investor was David de Vries, a famous navigator and a trader. He had been all over the world, from Indonesia, South America, and so forth. But he was going to have a settlement there to put in a whale oil training station. Training without the I, without the double I, train oil is whale oil. Whales would inhabit or come into Delaware Bay on a seasonal basis, and his idea was to kill some whales and get the oil to use in lamps and so forth. Well, it was wiped out the next spring when he went back to see how the 30-some men he had settled there were doing. They were all dead in the field. And I won't go into why it happened, but it was a disaster for his patroonship, as you can imagine. A year later, Lord Baltimore has a charter granted for land in that same area or west of there. And Augustine Hermans, when he was disputing or negotiating with the governor of Maryland, he asked to see the charter, and the governor had to go off to another plantation for a court session, and he left Hermans alone with the charter, which was in Latin, and apparently one of his many languages turned out to be Latin. And in the Latin text of this 1632 document, he found the words haec tenus inculta, land, you shall have all of the land not previously settled by Christians. And of course, the Dutch had been there the year before. So the argument the Dutch were able to make that they had no right to Delaware Bay or the Delaware River because they had been there a year earlier than the charter was even written. And when the dispute came about in the 1700s between Pennsylvania and Maryland over the three lower counties, they were able to argue the point that that this was actually Dutch territory, and it was part of this charter that indicated that they couldn't settle an area that had previously been settled by Christians. So they made the compromise of the three lower counties to become Delaware.
So there we have it.
I rest my case. And it's a very strong one because there are folders of documentation. Some of the early translators are sent to New York from Baltimore and from Philadelphia to find the original documents to strengthen their case in the matter. And I think it's at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in the Coates papers. You'll find a lot of these documents, transcriptions and translations. But it was finally settled, I think, in the 1740s.
There we have it. Delaware, the first state to ratify the United States Constitution in 1787.
Right.
Owes its existence to the Dutch.
That's right.
I know we've got a few questions coming in, Josie, so I'm going to turn it over to you to walk us through those.
Okay, thank you so much. What a great presentation. We do have a few questions and I want to hopefully get through them. I'm going to start with a real quick one, and it's a good question. Is there an index to these volumes of translations that somebody could search by name?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was an easy one. Searching out with an easy.
In fact, the names, we've always been very careful about making sure that all of the variations of a name are given in the index because of the spelling conventions at that time, or lack of spelling conventions. They appear in various forms. So yes, every volume has a subject index.
Great. We have another question about, are there any plans or a timeline for translating documents from between 1661 and 64? Any plans in the works?
Yeah, I have a draft of volume 14, and I promised that I would finish it. But so yeah, that's in the works. And actually, I did already a little bit on 15 as well. I have, but that's really like a first stage draft.
Yeah, they'll all follow right in a row. 14 and 15 right after
Yeah.
13.
Yeah,
Yeah.
14 is, I need to go through it one more time, but I wanted to do it with 13 in my hand so I can see, I want to do it the exact same way. So I'm waiting for 13 basically to be out.
And council minutes 9 and 10 are all transcribed already, and they're waiting translation.
Yeah, all this stuff has been transcribed.
Right.
So that is, nobody has to worry about that anymore. But
that's very significant, by the way. Very significant accomplishment for those two.
Yeah, they're all done. All of it is finished.
So this actually brings me to a question about, I mean, this is such a monumental task to transcribe and then translate all these documents. And plus it's been going on for centuries. Other translations have been done. Do you ever find inaccuracies in the earlier translations? Or
yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
What's a good one?
One classic mistranslation was actually done by one of the best translators, Van Laar, where he talks about being in a house with 28 drunken Indians, and there was a lot of trouble as a result of it. And it turns out that the 28 is an ain, one drunken Indian, and not 28. And there are things like that. It depends on, he might have been in a rush or whatever, just didn't see the configuration of ain, EEN clearly, and read it as a 28. But there are other.
But Charlie, there is a really funny one too that was by Dijkman, I think, and or like in Beverwijk still, and I'll never forget that one. There was something like at Fort Orange. There was a threat, and there were like I forgot the number, but 5 or 6 or 400 or 500 Indians on the river. And they were threatening the village. And then it was, and the original said, they had een oogje in het zeil te houden. And to keep an eye in the sail is literally translated. It's like just to pay attention. And they must have seen the 2 O's as the O's from the 200 or whatever. So it was a complete mistaken translation error.
There's another one involving the Indians on Long Island, where there's a problem with the Indians, and the explanation is because they weren't allowed to have beer. The Dutch weren't going to provide them with beer, and the word that they're translating as not beer, no beer, is nietap, as if niet tappen, they're not going to tap beer for the Indians, and nietap in the local Indian language means friend. So they're actually saying friend to the Dutch and not castigating them for not tapping more beer. And there are things like that that turn up, and I have a folder full of them, but you have to be very careful with the earlier translators. They didn't have what we have today to work with. They didn't have the big Dutch dictionary, for example. And we have so much more information that we can check, confirm, and use to make a more accurate translation. They were some of the translators in the 19th century, they were dealing with little like handbook dictionaries. And
It's amazing how much they got done.
Yeah.
It's
yeah,
just,
I'm impressed.
just
I've always been impressed by what they were able to do.
yeah, whenever you hear people say like, oh, O'Callaghan or Furneaux, they are so bad. And it's like, how can you say that? You know, it's amazing the quantity of the work, and also the quality actually is not so bad at all.
Right.
Considering like, yeah, I mean, we have the woordenboek van de Nederlandse taal on the computer. You can just do one click and you got it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think it's
right.
amazing the quantity and quality of your work. So it's a big undertaking to translate all these documents, and we're so happy that you were able to come today and talk to us about this process. Thank you so much. There are some other questions that we weren't able to get to. Those can always be, we can try to answer those via email. You can email us at aptrust@nysed.gov, and we'll try to get those taken care of. But in the meantime, thank you to all of you, Charlie, Dennis, Janny, Tom, and thank you to everyone who attended today's presentation. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content that we create and you want some more of it, please contact us at the same email, aptrust@nysed.gov, to receive a free past issue of New York Archives magazine. I highly recommend it. You can stay tuned for our next online speaker series at 12:30 on Thursday, March 4th, where we'll be joined by the creators of the exhibit, The Changemakers, Rochester Women Who Changed the World, at the Rochester Museum and Science Center. We'll be discussing how a community curation model, including sourcing objects from contemporary individuals, can enhance the accuracy, quality, diversity, and authentic representation within an exhibit, and how the voices of the community can push museum professionals and leadership to evolve their thinking around creating an exhibit. So if you'd like more information about that, please visit our website at nysarchivestrust.org to learn more. And again, thank you so much to all of our participants today. I hope you have a great day.